In the upscale neighborhood of Chelsea, London, the air always felt heavy with secrets. John Kensington, a successful finance professional, had it all: a beautiful home, a doting wife, and a teenage son. To the outside world, everything was perfect, but inside the walls of their posh house, something darker simmered, something that would soon unravel in ways no one could imagine. It all began when Patricia, Linda's mother, moved in after her husband's sudden death. Patricia was nothing like the frail, grieving widow people expected her to be. At nearly 60, she was still strikingly beautiful, with sharp green eyes and a body that turned heads. She carried herself with the elegance of someone who had lived a privileged life, and for John, the attraction was immediate. Linda was busy with her demanding job as a social worker, leaving little time to tend to the cracks that had formed in their marriage. Over the years, their conversations had dwindled to mundane topics about their son Luke's school or what to pick up for dinner. There was no passion left between them, no intimacy. Linda's long work hours took her away from the family, and John, feeling emotionally isolated, began to find solace in the most unlikely person, his mother-in-law. It wasn't planned. It never is. Patricia, keenly observant, noticed John's detachment from Linda. She played the grieving widow for a while, but it wasn't long before she started making herself comfortable. Late-night conversations became their norm. While Linda was away for work, Patricia and John would sit in the dimly lit living room, talking about everything and nothing. It was innocent at first. Discussions about the stock market, shared frustrations about life, and even some stories about her own troubled marriage. One evening, after a few glasses of wine, Patricia confided in John something that no one knew, not even her daughter. "You know," she said, her voice hushed and secretive, "I wasn't always faithful to Linda's father." She leaned in, her eyes locking with his. "There were others, but he never knew. He never cared." John should have felt uncomfortable, but he didn't. Instead, he was drawn to her vulnerability, her raw honesty. He too shared his own unhappiness, how Linda had been so focused on her career that she hadn't noticed how distant they had become. Patricia was the first person who listened, really listened without judgment. That was the beginning. Emotional connections turn into dangerous territories when fed by neglect and loneliness. Patricia knew how to manipulate John, inch by inch, luring him closer into her web. It wasn't just the late-night talks. Patricia's seduction was subtle, slow, and deliberate. She started wearing more revealing clothes around the house, things she wouldn't have dared wear in front of her daughter. John noticed. How could he not? She'd brush past him in the kitchen, her arm grazing his, lingering for just a moment too long. The tension built steadily, and Patricia fed into it. She began giving him small tokens of affection, expensive cufflinks, just because, cooking his favorite meals when Linda wasn't home. Their bond deepened not just emotionally, but physically. John found himself unable to resist the allure of a woman who understood him, who made him feel wanted again. One night, after Linda had gone to bed early, Patricia found John alone in the living room. She sat next to him, far too close for comfort. Without saying a word, she placed her hand on his thigh, her touch electric. John froze, but Patricia leaned in, her lips hovering just above his ear. "You deserve more than what you're getting," she whispered. That was the moment everything changed. John kissed her. It was a kiss filled with months of pent-up frustration, guilt, and lust. And Patricia kissed him back, pulling him into her like she had been waiting for this very moment. What made their affair even more dangerous was the financial connection that bound them. Patricia had a large shareholding in the company where John worked, a fact that John had only discovered recently. At first, he was shocked that his mother-in-law had so much influence over his career, but Patricia used this as leverage to keep him close. "You know," she said one evening, leaning over his shoulder as he worked from home, If you play your cards right, you could be promoted to the executive board within a year. I can help you with that." John was hooked, not just emotionally and physically, but now financially. He was tied to Patricia in ways that went beyond their secret trysts. She had power over him, and she knew it. She used it to her advantage, subtly manipulating him to spend more time with her, drawing him further into her control. Linda, despite being busy with work, wasn't blind. She began noticing the small changes. John was always on his phone, texting someone late into the night. His business trips had increased, and she found it strange that Patricia always seemed to know when he'd be home. And then there were the glances, those stolen, lingering looks between John and Patricia when they thought no one was watching. One evening, as she was cleaning up the kitchen, she found a hotel receipt tucked away in John's coat pocket. It wasn't just any hotel, it was the same luxury hotel where Patricia had mentioned attending a business conference just a week earlier. Linda's heart sank. The signs were there, but she didn't want to believe it. Linda confided in her best friend, Sophie, who immediately sensed something was off. Sophie had never liked Patricia. "She's always been too close to John," Sophie said. "You need to dig deeper. Something's going on." Linda began her quiet investigation. She checked John's phone when he wasn't looking, scanned his emails, and even followed him once when he said he was heading to a meeting. What she found devastated her. There were messages between him and Patricia, messages filled with intimate promises and secret plans. The final straw came when she found a pair of diamond earrings in Patricia's room. Linda knew they weren't hers, and when she asked Patricia about them, her mother brushed her off, saying they were a gift from an old friend. But Linda knew better. She had seen those same earrings listed in John's online purchase history. Her suspicions confirmed, Linda was left with one question. How could her own mother betray her like this? The woman who raised her, the woman she had trusted with her life, had not only seduced her husband, but was systematically tearing apart her family. Linda couldn't sleep that night. The evidence she had gathered was overwhelming. Her mother and her husband, the two people closest to her, had betrayed her in the worst way possible. The weight of the truth crushed her, and she lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment in her mind, searching for signs she might have missed. A knot of rage began to form in her chest. How long had this been going on? How could they do this to her? She felt as though her life had been shattered into a million pieces, and there was no way to put it back together. The next morning, Linda decided that she could no longer stay silent. She needed answers, and she needed them now. It was a Sunday. The Kensington home was quiet, with Luke spending the day at a friend's house. Linda saw this as the perfect opportunity to confront John and Patricia. She was not going to hold back. She was done with playing the role of the naive wife. John sat in the living room, tapping away at his laptop, completely oblivious to the storm that was brewing. Patricia, dressed in one of her usual expensive silk robes, wandered into the room with a cup of coffee. Linda watched them from the kitchen, disgust boiling inside her. She had seen them like this so many times, acting normal as if they were just family, as if nothing was wrong. But today it would end. Linda stormed into the room, her voice shaking with anger. "I know what's been going on between the two of you," she spat, her voice cold and furious. "I know everything." John's face turned pale. His fingers froze on the keyboard and his eyes darted to Patricia, who remained eerily calm. Patricia took a slow sip of her coffee before placing the cup down on the table with a soft clink. "Linda, darling, I think you're overreacting," Patricia said coolly, her eyes locking onto Linda's. "Let's talk this through." "Don't darling me," Linda snapped. "You've been screwing my husband behind my back, and you." She turned her glare towards John, who looked like he was about to collapse under the weight of guilt. "You're a coward, John. You betrayed me. You betrayed our family." John opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His mind raced, trying to find a way to explain himself, to make sense of the mess he had created. But what excuse could he possibly give for the betrayal of his wife with her own mother? Patricia, however, was not about to let Linda tear her carefully constructed world apart. She stood up slowly, her eyes narrowing. "You've never appreciated him," she said, her voice laced with venom. "You never loved him the way I did. You were always too busy with your work, too caught up in your little social crusades to see that your husband needed more. And I gave him that." Linda's heart pounded in her chest, her rage boiling over. "You disgust me," she hissed. "You're nothing but a manipulative, selfish—" Before Linda could finish, Patricia lunged. It was as if something inside her snapped. She grabbed a wine bottle from the table and swung it with all her strength. The glass shattered against Linda's skull, sending her sprawling to the floor with a sickening thud. Blood trickled down her face as she tried to push herself up, but Patricia wasn't done. The rage that had simmered beneath Patricia's calm exterior now erupted into violent fury. She grabbed the nearest object, a kitchen knife that had been left on the counter, and advanced towards Linda, her face twisted in a grotesque mask of hatred. John stood frozen, watching in horror as the scene unfolded before his eyes. He could hardly believe what was happening. Patricia raised the knife and plunged it into Linda's side with a brutal force. Linda screamed, a blood-curdling sound that echoed through the house. Patricia didn't stop. She stabbed again and again, each thrust filled with the raw, terrifying power of her obsession. John finally snapped out of his stupor and lunged toward Patricia, grabbing her arm, but it was too late. Linda lay motionless, her body a bloody mess on the living room floor, her eyes wide open in a final, frozen expression of disbelief. John stumbled back, his hands shaking as he looked at the blood-soaked scene before him. Patricia turned towards him, her breathing heavy, the knife still clutched in her hand. "We had no choice," she whispered, her voice trembling. "She was going to ruin everything." John couldn't breathe. His mind raced, his heart pounded, and the reality of what had just happened started to sink in. "What the hell have you done?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "You killed her. You killed my wife." Patricia dropped the knife, her hands shaking. She walked towards John, trying to calm him, her voice soft, almost pleading. "We had no choice, John. She was going to expose us. She was going to destroy you, destroy everything we've built." John recoiled from her touch. He couldn't look at her, couldn't process what had just happened. "Everything we've built. You just murdered my wife. How could you think this is something I wanted?" Patricia's face twisted in disbelief. "I did this for us, John, for our future. We can be together now, don't you see? There's no Linda in the way, no more secrets." John's blood ran cold. Patricia's words made it clear. This wasn't just a crime of passion. This was something darker, something far more sinister. She had planned this, manipulated everything, convinced herself that this murder would somehow bring them closer. But all John felt was disgust. "I don't want you," John whispered, backing away from her, shaking his head. "I never wanted this." The reality of rejection set in, and Patricia's calm exterior cracked. Her face contorted with rage, and she grabbed the knife again. "You don't get to leave me," she screamed. "After everything I've done for you, you belong to me, John." John turned and ran, bolting out of the living room and up the stairs. He had to get out of the house, had to get away from her. Patricia chased after him, knife in hand, her screams echoing through the halls of the house. John could feel his heart pounding in his chest as he ran down the hallway looking for an escape. He reached the bedroom and slammed the door behind him, locking it just as Patricia pounded on the other side. "You can't hide from me, John," she yelled, her voice filled with madness. "You belong to me." John frantically searched for his phone, his hands trembling as he dialed 911. He could hear Patricia on the other side of the door, her breathing heavy, the sound of the knife scraping against the wood. "Please," he whispered into the phone. "You have to come quickly. My wife is dead. My mother-in-law. She's trying to kill me." The minutes felt like hours. The police arrived just in time. John could hear the sirens approaching as Patricia's screams grew louder, more frantic. She was banging on the door with the knife, but before she could break through, the police burst into the house. John collapsed on the floor as the officers restrained Patricia, her manic screams filling the air. "You can't take him from me. We were meant to be together." As John was led out of the house, covered in blood and shaking from the shock, he looked back one last time. Patricia was still screaming, still fighting against the officers, her eyes wild with obsession. But it was over. Linda was dead, and John's life, once filled with secrets and lust, was now nothing but a broken, blood-stained nightmare.